Christmas morning should have been filled with joy, the smell of pine and cinnamon, the sound of carols on the radio, the kind of day my mother once made feel magical when she was alive. But instead, it turned into the cruelest reminder of how cold my father had become. Ava wore her little green sweater with a reindeer stitched on the front, her mittened hands carefully carrying a gift she had picked herself, a framed drawing of her and her grandfather holding hands, because she still believed he might soften if she just kept showing love. When we reached his front porch, the wreath sparkled with lights, the snow crunched beneath our boots, and I thought for a fleeting moment maybe things would be different this year. But then he opened the door, stared at her like she was a stranger, and in a tone sharp enough to slice the air, he said she wasn't his granddaughter, and she needed to leave. The words hung in the frozen air like shards of glass, and before I could react, Ava's small body crumpled with sobs, her drawing slipping into the snow, the glass frame cracking against the steps. I gathered her into my arms, my own chest shaking with anger, and without another word, I turned away from that doorway, leaving behind the smell of roasted turkey and the hollow echo of a man who had chosen pride over love. But the truth is, that moment was not an isolated act. It was the climax of years of dismissals that made me realize he never truly accepted Ava. I remembered her 5th birthday when all the cousins ripped open brightly wrapped toys, while he handed her a plain envelope of bills with no name, loudly declaring that real parents should provide for their children, and he didn't believe in spoiling kids who weren't worth his time. She smiled and held that envelope like treasure. But when she blew out her candles, her eyes searched for the same joy the others had received and found none. Another time, during her school Christmas concert, she wore a little red dress with sequins and scanned the crowd for his face, ready to sing her solo line with all the courage in her heart, only to find his seat empty because he had slipped out halfway through. She sang the rest of the song bravely, but her lip trembled, and when she asked me afterward if Grandpa had heard her, I forced a smile and said he had, though inside I burned at the truth that he hadn't even clapped once. Each slight seemed small in the moment, but together they formed a pattern too sharp to ignore. There was the summer barbecue when he decided to make a spectacle out of cruelty, announcing in front of the whole family that no stranger's blood would ever carry his legacy. Ava sat quietly with her plate of watermelon slices, her cheeks pink, not from the heat, but from shame. And that night, she wouldn't eat, wouldn't play, just whispered to me if Grandpa thought she was invisible. Another Sunday, when she ran with open arms to hug him after dinner, he pulled back and stuck out his hand for a shake, treating her like a guest rather than his own granddaughter. And at her elementary school graduation, with her yellow dress and her proud little cap, he hugged each of the other grandchildren while she stood waiting until he muttered something about traffic and walked right past her, leaving her small body frozen in place, smile fading like a candle in the wind. Every one of those moments had left a scar, but I kept hoping maybe time would soften him, maybe love would seep through, until Christmas morning showed me the truth more clearly than ever. He never intended to love her. Walking home through the snow with Ava's tears soaking my coat, I felt something shift inside me. For years I had been the dutiful daughter, excusing his hardness as just his way, convincing myself that keeping the peace was better than fighting, telling myself he came from a different generation, but when I saw her gift shattered on the steps, I knew I had reached the end of silence. I kissed her hair, whispered that she was loved beyond measure, and promised her that no man on this earth could erase her place in my life. Yet in the same breath I made another promise, one only I could hear, that this cycle of coldness and cruelty would end with me. I would not let her grow up thinking she was less. I would not let his pride define her worth, and I would no longer protect his image at the expense of her heart. That Christmas morning might have taken away the last illusion I had of him as a grandfather, but it gave me the strength to stand not as his daughter begging for approval, but as a mother ready to shield her child and deliver the justice she deserved. Back home, the house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your chest until you struggle to breathe. I set Ava down on the couch, her cheeks still streaked with tears, her little hands twisting the hem of her sweater, and I tried to be steady while inside my own hands trembled. I made hot cocoa the way my mother once made it for me, with a marshmallow melting on top, but even that comfort barely reached her as she whispered that maybe Grandpa never wanted her to exist. I wrapped her in a blanket, pulled her against me, and told her she was more loved than she could ever imagine, that one man's hardness could never define her value, but deep down I knew this wound ran deeper than any warm drink could heal. It was not just about this Christmas morning. It was about every time he had cut her down, every moment she had questioned if she belonged, and I felt a fury rise in me that no longer wanted to hide. So I picked up my phone, opened the family group chat that he had always controlled with his sharp comments and his rules, and I typed 4 words that felt like thunder: deal with everyone. Then I set the phone down, held Ava tighter, and waited for the storm that I knew would follow. The storm came quickly. My father began calling me within minutes, his name flashing across the screen again and again, but I let it ring, watching the number climb. 5 calls, 10, 20, until by evening the log showed 37 missed attempts. I didn't answer, because I knew what he would say. He would accuse me of creating drama, of twisting his words, of poisoning the family. And sure enough, my cousins started texting, repeating his lines almost word for word, claiming that I had exaggerated, that Ava must have misunderstood, that he was just old-fashioned and didn't mean harm. They told me to let it go, to stop ruining the holiday, to be the bigger person, as though silence in the face of cruelty was a virtue. My father had always known how to twist the family into his shield, and once again they lined up behind him, not out of love, but out of fear of his disapproval. It was a script I had seen before, him setting the stage, them echoing his words, and me standing alone. But this time I wasn't alone, because Ava's tear-streaked face burned in my memory like a flare, reminding me that I was not just his daughter anymore, I was a mother with something worth fighting for. The more I thought about it, the clearer the pattern became, like a puzzle I had tried to ignore, but could no longer unsee. He had controlled every holiday invitation, deciding who was welcome and who was excluded, always reminding me that our family name meant something, and that he would protect it from outsiders. He had measured affection like currency, giving it freely to those who bowed to him and withholding it from anyone who dared to live differently. He had used guilt as a tool, reminding me of what he had provided when I was younger, as though kindness was a debt I would never be free of. And now he had shifted that cruelty to my daughter, carrying his cold legacy forward into another generation, as though her only inheritance from him would be rejection. I sat at the kitchen table that night, the lights of the Christmas tree flickering in the corner, and I began writing everything down. Every slight, every cruel remark, every public humiliation. Not because I wanted to wallow in bitterness, but because I needed clarity. Seeing it all laid out on paper removed the fog of doubt that had clouded me for years, and what remained was a single truth. He had never really loved her, and no amount of patience or silence would ever change that. When I looked at that list of cruelties, something inside me hardened into resolve. I realized I had spent too long waiting for him to soften, for him to choose kindness, for him to be the grandfather Ava needed, and it had never happened. Instead, each year had chipped away at her spirit, and this Christmas morning had been the final blow. I tucked Ava into bed, kissed her forehead, and promised her aloud that things were going to change, that I would never let her feel unwanted again. Then I walked back to my phone, opened his string of unanswered messages, and typed just one line in reply to his frantic calls. "You'd better start praying." It wasn't rage, it wasn't even a threat. It was a promise to myself that the balance of power in this family was about to shift. For the first time in my life, I felt no fear of his disapproval, only a calm certainty that the man who had built his world on pride and cruelty was finally going to face the consequences he had earned. The next morning, the snow outside lay untouched, smooth as a blank page. But inside me, the storm from Christmas had not quieted. I moved through the house, cleaning up wrapping paper, trying to bring order to the chaos, when I pulled out a box of old ornaments my mother had left me. Most were chipped from years of use, but tucked among them was one with her neat handwriting on a brittle paper tag. It read, "Kindness Clause, never forget." I froze, staring at the faded ink, my heart racing because those 2 words unlocked a memory I had buried long ago. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table as a teenager, overhearing my mother whisper to her best friend that she had written special instructions into her estate papers, a clause meant to make sure the family stayed generous and united even after she was gone. At the time, I thought it was just sentimental talk, but holding that ornament now, I realized she had meant something much more serious. My father had always controlled the narrative, but my mother had quietly planted a seed of protection, and suddenly I wondered if she had left behind more than just memories. The thought sent me searching through the closet where I kept old binders and boxes. Buried under stacks of tax forms and family recipes was a blue binder labeled in her careful cursive, "Family Matters." My hands shook as I opened it, half afraid of what I might find, and inside were copies of letters she had written to the church, the library, and even a local community center. Each one spoke of her desire to create a small scholarship in our family name to help children from the neighborhood pursue music, art, or whatever dream lit them up. She had written about kindness as a duty, about how wealth without generosity was empty, and about how her greatest wish was that her grandchildren grow up feeling supported and loved. There were also trustee documents, with my father listed first, but clear notations about successor trustees if he failed to act in the best interests of all named beneficiaries. My throat tightened as I realized Ava's name was included, written in my mother's hand before she had passed, proof that my daughter was never supposed to be excluded. It was as if my mother had reached out from the past to give me a weapon made not of anger, but of love. I sat there for hours, reading every page, remembering little details that now made sense. The neighbor who once told me my mother insisted on that scholarship being mentioned in her will. The church administrator who once joked that my mother's generosity had set a standard nobody could match. Even the town librarian who mentioned my mother had donated books under our family name, though my father had delayed the official dedication for years. It all painted the same picture. My mother had built a blueprint for kindness, but my father had ignored or hidden it, bending everything to his pride. I thought of how many times he had accused me of being dramatic, of twisting events, of disrespecting him, and how he had always used his power to silence me. Yet here, in my hands, was something stronger than his voice, evidence that his own wife had put in writing a vision he had betrayed. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of power shift inside me. Not rage, but a steady flame of certainty. That night, after putting Ava to bed, I sat by the tree with the binder open on my lap, the ornament with the faded tag resting against my palm. I whispered, "Thank you" to my mother, knowing she had left me exactly what I needed at the moment I needed it most. The path forward was not about shouting louder than my father, or stooping to his level. It was about shining a light on the truth he had tried to bury. He had always believed pride was stronger than love, that control was stronger than compassion. But my mother's words told another story, one where love had the final word, and so I decided that night to follow the map she had left me. I would gather witnesses, I would collect every piece of evidence, and I would build a case not with venom, but with undeniable clarity. My father had spent years making me feel powerless, but now, holding those papers, I realized he had left cracks in his armor, cracks my mother had carved open with her belief in kindness, and I was ready to pour the light through. Once the shock of discovery settled, I realized that having my mother's binder was not enough on its own. I needed to understand it, frame it, and protect it so my father could not twist it the way he twisted every story in our family. So I called Mrs. Patel, a local attorney who had been both my neighbor and, in many ways, a quiet mentor since Ava was a baby. Sitting in her office with snow dripping off my boots, I laid the binder on her desk and told her everything, from the Christmas morning cruelty to the cruel years that came before. She flipped through the pages slowly, her finger tracing the trustee clauses, her eyebrows rising when she read the words, "Act in the best interests of all named beneficiaries." Then she looked at me and explained in clear, simple language that what my mother had left was more than sentiment. It was a trust with legal obligations, and a trustee who acted in bad faith by excluding a beneficiary, publicly humiliating them, or misusing funds, could be replaced. It wasn't about revenge, she said. It was about duty. I felt my shoulders ease for the first time in weeks, because I realized I didn't have to fight dirty. I just had to let the truth do the work. From there, I began to gather evidence carefully, not in anger, but in order. I printed out text messages where my father had dismissed Ava as not one of us. I saved photos from family events where she was left out, and I spoke quietly with relatives who had seen enough to feel uneasy. Some shrugged and tried to dodge the conversation, afraid of crossing him, but others, to my surprise, admitted they had long felt the chill of his pride and were ready to tell the truth if asked. I went to the church administrator and requested copies of the letters my mother had sent about the scholarship fund, and he handed me a folder of correspondence that showed how the project had been stalled by my father's excuses. At the library, I found records of donations made in our family's name, money that had sat unused for years instead of serving children the way my mother intended. Each piece of paper was like a puzzle piece falling into place, and with every new fact, I felt the knot in my chest loosening. For once, I was no longer scrambling to defend myself. I was building a foundation solid enough to stand on. Still, I knew that exposing him privately would not be enough, because my father's power had always thrived in the shadows of whispered conversations and half-truths. So I thought carefully about how to bring the truth into the open without making it look like vengeance. That was when I remembered the tradition my mother had loved most, the family gratitude night at the church hall every New Year's weekend. After she died, the tradition had faded because my father claimed it was too much work, but the hall still existed, and the people who once gathered still remembered. I reached out to the pastor and explained that I wanted to revive the event in her honor, with a potluck meal, a slideshow of her letters, and a simple announcement about the scholarship fund finally being activated. He smiled warmly and told me that sounded exactly like what Edith would have wanted. I reserved the hall quietly, sent out invitations framed as a celebration of my mother's legacy, and asked everyone to bring a dish and a memory. Outwardly, it looked like nothing more than a loving tribute. Inwardly, it was the stage where truth would be impossible to ignore. As the days passed leading up to New Year's, I played my role calmly, answering holiday texts with simple notes of thanks, keeping Ava close, and preparing the slideshow late at night while she slept. My father must have caught wind of something, because his calls became more frantic, his voicemails swinging between anger and pleading, but I ignored them all. I wasn't interested in being baited into a shouting match. I was interested in letting him reveal himself in front of the people he had always controlled. I could almost hear my mother's voice reminding me that the loudest battles don't need the loudest weapons. They just need patience and precision. And so I stitched together her letters, the trust documents, the community records, into a story that was not about me at all, but about the promise she had left us. My father thought power meant having the last word, but I was learning that real power comes from having the right words, and soon those words would speak for themselves. For the first time in years, I felt ready, not afraid, and more than that, I felt certain. It didn't take long for my father to sense that the ground beneath him was shifting, because the closer New Year's weekend came, the more desperate his behavior became. At first, it was the constant calls, not the measured, commanding voice I had known all my life, but a strained mixture of scolding and pleading that swung like a pendulum. One voicemail told me to grow up, stop stirring trouble, and remember who had fed me when I was young. The next, sent just an hour later, begged me to sit down privately and not embarrass the family. I let them pile up, 37 missed calls in just one evening, the same number I had already counted on Christmas night, and I read them like proof of his unraveling. He had always been the man who controlled the narrative, who silenced others before they could speak, and now he was the one shouting into a void while I refused to answer. That silence was louder than any argument, and it frightened him more than rage ever could. When the voicemails failed, he turned to family allies, using my cousins and uncles as his mouthpieces. One cousin called and said I was being unfair, that Grandpa was old-fashioned but not cruel, that I should think of the children and not break family traditions. Another texted me late at night accusing me of chasing money, twisting my mother's will into something self-serving. I could almost see my father's fingerprints on their words, his favorite tactic of deflecting guilt onto the person who dared to stand up to him. But I didn't take the bait. Instead, I calmly replied with links to scanned copies of my mother's letters about the scholarship and the trust clause naming Ava. A few cousins fell silent after that. Others mumbled apologies. But I knew my father had lost a weapon that had always served him well: unquestioned loyalty. For years he had relied on their fear of losing his approval. Now they were faced with the undeniable proof that he was the one betraying our family's values. His next attempt was more direct, and for him more humiliating. One afternoon he appeared at my doorstep, his posture stiff against the winter wind, holding an envelope. He handed it to me without meeting my eyes, mumbling that it was for Ava, to cover private lessons, or whatever I thought she needed. I opened it and found a check, written in his familiar sharp handwriting, with a sum large enough to buy silence for many families in our town. But to me it was nothing more than hush money, an attempt to rewrite history with dollars the way he had always done when his reputation was at stake. I placed the envelope back into his gloved hand and told him calmly that if he wanted to help Ava, he could do it through the scholarship my mother had established. Then I closed the door before he could respond, the first time in my life I had ever shut him out. That evening, I mailed the check back to him by certified post, with a short note attached: "All support for Ava must go through the Edith Foundation." It was not anger, it was clarity, and clarity was something he had no defense against. By the week of the event, I could see the panic etched into every message he sent. He warned me that I was destroying the family name, that I was acting like a traitor, that my mother would be ashamed of me. Yet those words rolled off me like water because I had her handwriting in my hands, her vision in my heart, and the knowledge that she would never have wanted her granddaughter treated the way he had treated Ava. Each day that passed, his power shrank and mine grew, not because I shouted louder, but because I refused to flinch. For years he had believed money, control, and intimidation would keep him untouchable, but now he was learning the one truth he had always feared, that when the facts come into the light, pride becomes very small. And as the final hours before the gathering ticked by, I knew he would either try to stop it or show up and face it. Either way, the stage was already set, and for the first time in my life I was not afraid of what would happen next. In the middle of all the noise, the missed calls, the whispers from relatives, the weight of preparing for what was coming, I forced myself to pause because I knew if I let anger be the only fuel, I would burn out before the fight was even finished. One quiet evening I sat on the living room floor with Ava, threading a new scarf I had started knitting for her, my hands clumsy but steady, the yarn winding between my fingers like a lifeline. She leaned against me, humming softly to herself, already calmer than she had been that Christmas morning, but still with questions in her eyes she hadn't dared to ask out loud. I told her stories of my mother, of how Grandma Edith always believed in kindness even when people were harsh, and I promised her that what happened on that porch was not the end of her story, only the start of something better. She nodded, holding the half-finished scarf to her cheek, and whispered that she believed me. That was the moment I realized I wasn't fighting just to correct an injustice. I was fighting to build a different future, one where Ava would never again question whether she belonged. It may sound strange, but that pause reminded me of something else. That the reason I share stories like this is because none of us are meant to carry these battles alone. Sometimes, when life knocks us down, the only thing that lifts us back up is knowing someone else understands. If you're listening right now and you've ever felt overlooked or watched someone you love be treated as if they didn't matter, then you know the kind of ache I'm talking about. And I want you to know something. Your support on this channel, whether it's a like, a comment, or even just listening all the way through, is more powerful than you realize. It doesn't just help me keep telling these stories. It creates a circle of voices that say, "You're not alone, and kindness still wins." So if you've got a moment, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, or share a little memory of your own family. It means the world to me, and it keeps this space alive with hope. After that night, something inside me felt lighter. I no longer saw my father as the giant figure looming over my choices. I saw him as a man whose pride had finally begun to crack under the weight of truth. The scarf grew longer, stitch by stitch, and with each row I felt myself weaving not just yarn, but resolve, the quiet strength of patience, the kind my mother had always carried. I knew the showdown was coming, and I knew he would resist until the very end, but I also knew that I didn't need to match his anger with anger. Instead, I would let calmness be my loudest weapon. Ava wore the scarf proudly even before it was finished, and seeing her smile reminded me that victory wasn't about humiliating my father, it was about healing what he had tried to break. By the time New Year's Eve approached, I felt ready. Not the kind of ready that comes from sharpening knives, but the kind that comes from steady breathing and clear vision. I had the documents, the witnesses, and the plan. More than that, I had the quiet backing of a few relatives who had stopped pretending and started telling the truth. And above all, I had Ava's trust. Fragile, but still alive, waiting for me to prove that love could stand taller than cruelty. My father thought silence made him strong, but I was learning that kindness spoken out loud was stronger. The event at the church hall would be the turning point, and for once, I wasn't dreading it. I was anticipating it, with the calm certainty that justice was no longer a dream, but a heartbeat, steady and unstoppable. The night of the gathering arrived with the kind of sharp winter air that makes every breath visible, and for a moment, as I carried the casserole dish into the church hall, I wondered if anyone would actually come. But when I pushed the doors open, my doubt melted away. The place glowed with strands of golden lights draped across the ceiling, the long tables filled with dishes that smelled of every family memory. 7 variations of green bean casserole, 3 hams, pies stacked like towers, and the unmistakable scent of my aunt's overly buttered rolls. Chairs scraped across the floor as neighbors and relatives settled in, the hum of conversation rising like a hymn, and in that sound I felt my mother's presence, as if she had orchestrated this from the very beginning. For the first time in years, the tradition she had loved most was alive again, and everyone seemed hungry, not just for food, but for belonging. I stood near the front, laptop hooked up to the projector, and watched as faces familiar and distant filled the room. My cousins, who had avoided my texts a week earlier, now sat with cautious expressions, whispering to one another. A few old friends of my mother's arrived with envelopes of photographs, eager to share stories. Even the town librarian and the church administrator had come, holding papers of their own. At one point, I caught sight of Ava weaving between chairs, carrying a plate of cookies she insisted on handing out to every table, her scarf wrapped snugly around her neck. The sight of her laughing with children who welcomed her without hesitation was the proof I needed that this night mattered. She belonged here, and nothing my father said could ever erase that truth. When it was time to begin, the pastor stepped forward, his voice warm and steady, and welcomed everyone to what he called Edith's Night of Gratitude. He spoke briefly about my mother's generosity, her laughter, her way of making even the smallest gathering feel like a celebration. Then he gestured for me to start the slideshow. My hands trembled only for a moment before I clicked the first image, a photo of my mother at a potluck years ago. apron dusted with flour, her smile wide and unguarded. The room hushed as letters appeared on the screen, her handwriting, delicate but firm, outlining her dreams for the scholarship fund, her belief that our family name should stand for kindness, not control. Page after page unfolded, each one reminding the room that Edith had left not just memories, but instructions, a clear vision for how love should be lived. I spoke little, letting her words carry the weight, but when I looked out at the crowd, I saw tears in more than one pair of eyes. The highlight of the night came when I introduced Ava as the first recipient of the Edith Foundation's support. I explained that her art lessons would be funded in honor of my mother, not as charity, but as a fulfillment of a promise made years before. The room erupted in applause, neighbors and relatives clapping with genuine warmth, some standing to cheer. Ava blushed, clutching my hand, and for once she wasn't invisible, she wasn't overlooked, she was celebrated. And in that moment, with the glow of the projector casting my mother's words across the wall and the sound of applause filling the hall, I knew the tide had turned. This was no longer about my father's approval or his pride. It was about a community recognizing the truth. The foundation had been born that night, and with it, the family narrative had begun to shift. When the slideshow ended and the last image of my mother's handwriting faded from the wall, the pastor let the applause settle before clearing his throat. His voice, warm but firm, carried through the room as he reminded everyone that Edith's legacy had always been about more than memories, that she had entrusted a vision to the family. Then, almost casually, but with deliberate weight, he said it would be fitting to hear from the trustee of the Edith Foundation himself. The room shifted all at once, dozens of eyes turning toward my father, the way a field of flowers might tilt toward the sun, though this time it was not warmth they sought, but accountability. For a long moment he stayed seated, his jaw locked, his hand tapping against his thigh with the nervous rhythm of a man who suddenly realized the script in his head might not match the one playing out in front of him. Pride finally pushed him upright, because Edward Foster had never been a man who could sit in silence when called upon. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his tie, and walked down the aisle with the measured steps of someone who still wanted to believe he owned the stage, but I could see the stiffness in his shoulders, the hesitation in his stride, and I knew he was walking into a light brighter than any spotlight he had ever faced. At the podium, he placed both hands on either side, gripping it tightly, as if bracing against a storm. He cleared his throat once, then again, buying time, searching for the authority that had always come so easily to him. For decades, he had spoken in this hall and others like it, delivering speeches about family, tradition, and reputation, his words commanding obedience, his tone brooking no dissent. But as he looked out at the crowd, he found not the usual nods and deferent smiles, but a sea of faces scanning the printed packets I had laid on every table. Their eyes moved from the highlighted clauses to him and back again, as though weighing the man against the words in front of them. For the first time in my life, I saw him falter. His voice, when it came, was steady but thinner than usual, a performance rather than the booming authority he once wielded. He spoke of legacy, of responsibility, of how difficult it was to carry a family's reputation alone, but the words felt hollow, bouncing off ears already tuned to something stronger, the truth they held in their hands. Mrs. Patel shifted forward in her chair, lifting her chin slightly, and when he paused to sip water, she raised her voice with calm courtesy. She didn't accuse him directly, didn't shout or scold, but explained in plain, careful language the duties of a trustee. Her words floated across the room like steady waves, reminding everyone that a trustee is not free to act on personal biases, but must uphold the best interests of all named beneficiaries. She spoke of fiduciary duty, of legal obligations, of fairness written into law, and she did it with the kind of clarity that left no room for twisting. My father tried to interject once, but she simply smiled politely and continued, her professionalism disarming him more than anger ever could. people around the tables began to murmur, not gossip, but recognition, a low hum of understanding that the man who had always lectured them was now being gently but firmly educated. I watched his face tighten, his lips pressing thin, his knuckles whitening on the podium, and I thought of every time he had dismissed me with a wave of his hand. Now he was the one cornered by words he could not control. I stepped forward then, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. I did not want to drag the moment out. I wanted to deliver the sentence that had lived in me since Christmas morning. From today, I said, calm and clear enough that even the children in the back row could hear, the fund activates as written, and Ava is acknowledged in full because my mother said so. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument because it pointed everyone's attention back to the one voice no one could deny, Edith's. The church administrator, who had been waiting quietly, took the cue and walked to the front, holding a folder. From it, he withdrew a single sheet of paper, my mother's handwritten kindness clause. His voice trembled slightly as he read it aloud, but the words rang like a bell in the hall. Any trustee who publicly shamed or excluded a child forfeited their role immediately, and a successor trustee would be appointed with the blessing of the community. The silence that followed was profound, the kind that makes the hum of the furnace and the shuffle of feet suddenly deafening. My father looked out at the crowd, and I saw the moment he realized he had no escape. The eyes staring back at him were no longer deferential but illuminated, carrying not anger but clarity, and clarity was something he could not bully, buy, or bend. I watched him struggle, his throat working, his mouth opening and closing as though words might still save him. But nothing came. For years he had believed power lived in his voice, in his ability to drown out others, but now power had shifted to the written words of a woman who had loved better than he ever could. He gripped the podium as though it might anchor him, but it only made him look smaller, a man holding on to wood because he had nothing else left to grasp. The hall didn't boo, didn't jeer, didn't throw accusations. It was worse than that. They waited, silent and still, forcing him to face himself in their eyes. Beside me, Ava squeezed my hand, her small fingers steady and sure, and I realized that the trap I had set had worked perfectly. Not a cruel trap, not one of humiliation for its own sake, but one of truth, light, and patience. He had walked into this night expecting to control the story as always, but instead he stood exposed, stripped of his usual weapons, with only his pride left to protect him. And pride was the weakest shield of all. The silence in the church hall stretched on until it became unbearable, and for the first time in my life I saw my father unable to speak. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes flicking across the room, searching for the familiar nods of approval that had always been his anchor, but they were gone. Instead, he saw cousins flipping through the packets again, pointing at the highlighted passages, whispering under their breath. He saw neighbors who had known him for decades, shaking their heads softly, not in anger, but in disappointment. He saw the pastor fold his hands, his expression calm but firm, ready to move forward whether my father accepted it or not. For years, Edward Foster had believed his word was the law of this family. But now he was faced with the reality that his authority had been stripped down to nothing more than soundless pride. The very thing he treasured most, his spotless reputation as the patriarch who held everything together, was unraveling in front of him, thread by thread, in the same hall where he had once commanded respect. The pastor finally broke the silence with a voice that was steady but left no room for argument. He explained that in light of the trust's wording and the kindness clause, the board of trustees would vote immediately to appoint a successor. Heads nodded around the room, people who once would have never dared oppose my father raising their hands without hesitation. It was not a rebellion, it was a quiet, collective act of truth. My father's face reddened, his mouth opening as if to protest, but the administrator quickly reminded him that this wasn't a matter of personal debate. It was a matter of written duty and legal clarity. The vote was swift, and when the pastor announced the result, unanimous in favor of replacement, a ripple of relief moved through the hall, like air finally released from a long-sealed chamber. My father sank back into his chair, his once imposing frame looking smaller than I had ever seen it, his hands clasped tightly as if to keep from shaking. For a man who had always lived to be in control, there could be no greater loss than being publicly and irrevocably replaced. The consequences spread faster than I could have imagined. The very next morning, the town's weekly paper ran a short column in its community section about the revival of the Edith Foundation, noting the unanimous vote to install new trustees and praising the first scholarship recipient, Ava Foster. It was only a few paragraphs, but in our small town, it carried more weight than any speech. Neighbors dropped by with casseroles, congratulating us, telling me how proud Edith would have been, how much they looked forward to seeing more children benefit. At the grocery store, I overheard people talking about the event, their voices low but certain, describing it as the night the truth finally came out. My father's name, once spoken with reverence, now carried a heaviness, not scandalous, but pitying. He hadn't been thrown out of the family, but he had been stripped of the armor he wore so tightly, the illusion of unquestioned respect. And that loss, more than money or position, cut deepest into him, because reputation had always been his currency. For me, the most powerful moment came quietly at home, when Ava pulled the newspaper from the kitchen counter and read the article out loud in her small, proud voice. She traced her name with her finger, smiling so wide her cheeks dimpled, and then she looked up at me and said, "Mom, Grandma really meant for me to be part of this." I hugged her tight, tears burning my eyes, because I realized the victory wasn't in watching my father fall. It was in seeing my daughter finally rise, finally recognized, finally able to believe she belonged. My father had lost what he valued most, but Ava had gained what she needed most, proof that she was loved, wanted, and protected by more than just me. And that was the true reversal. The balance had shifted from a legacy of pride to a legacy of kindness, from a man's cold control to a woman's quiet determination. The hall that night had not just ended his reign, it had rewritten our family story, and there was no going back. In the weeks that followed the vote, the house finally felt lighter, as though the air itself no longer carried his shadow. Yet something inside me still itched with unanswered questions. How had he grown so hard, so incapable of love, that he could stand on his porch on Christmas morning and tell a child she wasn't his blood? The answer came unexpectedly one afternoon when my mother's oldest friend, Mrs. Callahan, dropped by with a tin of cookies and a knowing look in her eyes. She had been quiet at the gathering, but now, in the calm after the storm, she seemed ready to speak. Over tea at my kitchen table, she told me something I had never known, that when my father was a boy, his own father had publicly humiliated him one Christmas, berating him in front of neighbors for being weak and unworthy, sending him away from the table like an embarrassment. She said he never spoke of it, but that night had carved a scar so deep he never healed, and instead of breaking the cycle, he repeated it. I sat stunned, my fingers tracing the rim of my mug, realizing that what I had seen as cruelty was also the echo of an old wound passed down like a poisoned heirloom. That knowledge didn't erase the pain he had caused, but it reframed it. For the first time, I understood that his pride wasn't strength. It was armor, brittle and heavy, forged out of shame he never knew how to lay down. He had spent his entire life trying to protect himself from feeling small again, but in the process, he made everyone else feel smaller than him. My daughter had been caught in the crossfire of his battle with a ghost, and I refused to let her carry the bruise any further. It struck me then that generational pain is like a baton in a race. You can keep passing it on, each runner weighed down by the burden, or you can drop it and refuse to let it travel another inch. My father had carried it his whole life, handing it to me without words, and I had almost, unconsciously, let it brush against Ava. But no more. The cycle would stop here, with me, with my choice to say no more coldness, no more shame disguised as tradition, no more children paying for the wounds of adults. One evening, I sat at my desk with a blank sheet of paper and wrote my father a letter, not to reconcile, not to pretend things could go back to the way they were, but to place the truth in his hands. I told him I knew about what had been done to him, that I understood now why he built his walls so high, but that I would not allow him to turn his walls into cages for my daughter. I told him he had a chance, even now, to lay down the armor, to speak kindness before it was too late, but that the choice was his alone. I ended it with a single line: "I won't pass the bruise to my daughter, I'll pass the light." I sealed it and mailed it the next day, not because I expected an answer, but because I wanted to close the loop in my own heart. Whether he read it or not, whether he let the truth in or not, was no longer my responsibility. My responsibility was Ava, to show her that we can acknowledge the hurt of the past without repeating it, that we can choose a new path even when the old one feels carved in stone. The next morning, Ava found me at the table, the letter already gone, and asked me if I still hated Grandpa. I pulled her onto my lap and told her the truth, that I didn't hate him. I pitied him, because a man who cannot give love is a man who has never learned how to hold it. She leaned against me quietly, as though absorbing a lesson without needing words, and I felt something inside me settle at last. The victory wasn't about tearing my father down. It was about refusing to let his brokenness define us. He had lived his life chained to the past, but I was free now, free to build a new story for Ava, one woven with warmth instead of ice. And that, I realized, was the deepest truth of all. You cannot always heal the wounds left by others, but you can stop them from spreading. That night, when I tucked Ava into bed, I whispered again what I had promised her on Christmas morning, that she was loved beyond measure, that no man's pride could erase her worth, and that in our family, from now on, love would always speak louder than shame. Life after the storm felt almost unreal, as if someone had turned down the constant hum of tension that I hadn't even realized was always there. The house seemed brighter even on cloudy mornings, because I no longer woke up wondering when my father's next cutting remark would land, or how I would shield Ava from it. Instead, I woke up to the sound of her humming in her room while she colored, her laughter carrying easily through the walls, no longer shadowed by the weight of trying to earn the affection of a man who had never intended to give it. Our days began to carry a softness I hadn't known we were missing. Simple things like baking cookies, shoveling snow together, or hanging up her artwork on the fridge took on new meaning because there was no longer a voice in the back of my mind reminding me that none of it would ever be enough for him. It felt as though by cutting him off from power, I had cut the thread that had bound my own heart in silence for so long. The Edith Foundation became real in the weeks that followed, and with it came a new kind of joy I hadn't expected. The first grant funded Ava's winter art class, and when she came home with paint on her hands and a grin wide enough to split her face, I knew my mother's vision was alive again. But it wasn't just Ava who benefited. Within a month, 3 other children from the community joined the program, their parents writing letters of thanks, their teachers calling to say what a difference it was making. Relatives who had once tiptoed around my father's pride began texting me pictures of their own kids holding paintbrushes or sketchbooks, little captions that read, "Thanks to Edith." For the first time in years, family group chats were filled not with tension and sharp remarks, but with shared pride in something good. It was as though my mother's kindness, long buried under his control, had finally broken through the soil and bloomed again, touching lives beyond just our own. Setting new boundaries wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. My father tried, more than once, to slip back into the center, sending short, clipped messages or appearing unannounced at events. But each time, I reminded him calmly that the foundation was no longer his to run, and that Ava's life was no longer open to his judgment. The first time I stood firm and asked him to leave, my hands shook, but my voice did not, and when the door closed behind him, Ava hugged me tight and whispered, "You kept your promise." That moment sealed everything. The old patterns were broken, and a new standard was set. From then on, every interaction came on my terms. If he wanted to show up, it had to be with respect, and if he couldn't manage that, he simply wasn't welcome. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and for once I didn't feel guilt about it. I felt peace, the kind that comes when you finally choose protection over appeasement. Looking back, I realized that Christmas morning had not just been the breaking point, it had been the doorway to something better. It had forced me to stop carrying the burden of keeping family peace at the expense of truth, and it had shown Ava that love sometimes means standing firm against even those who share your blood. She no longer asked me if she was invisible to her grandfather, because she no longer needed his acknowledgement to feel whole. She had the embrace of a community, the recognition of a legacy, and most importantly, the daily assurance of a mother who would never let her doubt her worth again. Our lives became quieter, simpler, but in that simplicity there was more warmth than I had ever known. The house that had once felt heavy with unspoken tension now felt alive with laughter, and I knew we had crossed the threshold into a new chapter, one where kindness was the rule, not the exception. The next Christmas arrived with a different rhythm, one that carried no dread, no forced smiles, no silent prayers that Ava wouldn't be hurt again. Instead of packing ourselves off to my father's house and bracing for the coldness waiting at the door, we walked hand in hand to the church hall where a new tradition had already taken root. Strings of lights twinkled across the ceiling. Long tables overflowed with dishes brought by neighbors and relatives, and at the center stood a tall tree covered in handmade ornaments crafted by children from the community. Each ornament told its own story, paper stars, clay angels, painted hearts. But together they created a mosaic of joy, a living symbol of what my mother had always wanted. The Edith Night of Kindness had been born from her words, but now it was carried by many hands, and as Ava pinned her bright star at the very top, I felt the weight of the past year lift. What had once been a day of humiliation and loss had become a day of belonging, and this time the air was filled not with pride and control, but with laughter and light. Even my father came, though not in the way he once would have. He arrived late, slipping quietly into the back of the hall, without his usual commanding stride. Gone was the man who demanded attention, who expected speeches to bend around him. In his place was a man, smaller, quieter, sitting alone at a corner table near the cocoa urn. He didn't approach the podium, didn't attempt to retake control, but handed the pastor a folded note, accepting the new structure of the foundation and acknowledging the successor trustees. It wasn't a confession, and it wasn't an apology, but it was a step. Perhaps the only one he was capable of. Some people gave him nods of polite recognition, but no one deferred to him the way they once had. For the first time, he was just another man in the room, not the center of it, and strangely, I found that I didn't feel anger anymore. What I felt was something softer, the awareness that justice doesn't always roar with thunder. Sometimes it settles quietly, like snow on a roof, stripping away illusions until only truth remains. Ava, of course, barely noticed him. She was too busy helping children hang their crafts, laughing with cousins who now treated her as if she had always been at the heart of things. At one point, she tugged my sleeve and whispered that she wanted to perform a small song she had learned in her art class. My heart squeezed as I watched her step up in front of the crowd, her voice ringing clear, no longer trembling the way it had at the school concert years ago when she searched in vain for her grandfather's applause. This time, when she finished, the hall erupted in cheers, hands clapping, voices calling her name. I watched her beam with pride, her shoulders lifted high, her eyes shining not with the ache of being unseen, but with the glow of being celebrated. That was when I realized the true measure of our victory, not that my father had been humbled, but that my daughter had been lifted up. The very wound he had tried to carve into her had become the place where resilience grew strongest. As the night wound down, I stood near the tree, the room buzzing with warmth, and thought about the journey that had brought us here. From the moment on the porch when his words broke my daughter's heart, to the thunder of 37 unanswered calls, to the calm resolve of finding my mother's binder, every step had led us to this new tradition. The story had not ended in bitterness or revenge, but in balance. The cold pride of one man outweighed by the enduring kindness of a woman who refused to be silenced even after she was gone. When the last dish was cleared and the lights dimmed, I wrapped Ava in her scarf and whispered a final truth, one she will carry long after I'm gone, that families bloom not through control or pride, but through love given freely. That is the legacy I choose to pass on. And if there is one simple moral to all of it, it is this: don't honor pride over people, because in the end, kindness always outlives cruelty. And before I finish, I just want to say something straight from my heart. If this story touched you even a little, please hit that like button, drop a comment, or even tell me where you're listening from. It really makes a difference. Every time you leave a kind word, it reminds me that I'm not just speaking into the air. I'm sitting across from friends who understand. Your support is what helps me keep sharing stories like this. And trust me, it means more to me than you'll ever know.